do this very often, but the discussion was very wide-ranging, so I'm going to put up a matrix and use that to frame my remarks. Our discussion was on the never-ending search for coherence and responsiveness, efforts to design a core curriculum, and we essentially agreed that this is a never-ending search. This is a discussion that many of us have had in many different contexts. It gets more difficult as you add more members in more countries, and the country contexts are different as well. We did agree clearly on a couple of points, and I will start with what we agreed with and then go into the realm of more debate. One is that the sort of constant back and forth, or the tension between training government officials, which you might put under the heading of management, and training important figures in public policy debates, which you might call policy training policy experts, constantly is a tension in virtually all of our schools. And I think there's no way fundamentally to resolve that discussion. And similarly, the debate between education and training, which is related. Are we providing an intellectual foundation for people that will carry them through their lives, or are we providing training in specific skills? And that is not a debate that can be resolved either. Many people said, look, that's a false dichotomy. That's a cliche. We all do elements of both, and many of us have different programs. So executive programs, for instance, are clearly more about training. When you're educating younger students, you're giving them broader perspectives. So those were the things we agreed on. What came out of the discussion, though, was that perhaps this constant search for one core curriculum, for one agreed set of skills that would help brand us in corporate speak as schools of public policy and management, is actually approaching the question the wrong way. That so often we say, look, law has a clear focus, medicine has a clear focus, business has a clear focus. What is our focus? And then the discussion ensues. There's a lot of pulling and hauling. Instead, it was proposed, wait a minute, we're training people, we're educating people for the full range of government. The full range of government includes everything from transport and waste management to nuclear proliferation. So obviously, it's very hard to think that you're going to have one core. And even in the skills domain, there are people working in government at many different levels in many different country contexts. So even there, it's very hard to identify one core set. It was proposed, Michael O'Hare from Berkeley said, look, why don't we think of ourselves as training or educating a cohort of people who will go into government, and that all of our schools together fit on a spectrum or within a matrix where we focus on different parts of that cohort. And instead of thinking of one school doing all of this, we ought to think of ourselves as part of a collaborative, at least in theory, enterprise to educate people who go into government service and public service. So what I did was to take a very stylized matrix, stylized in the sense that any one of you, and I see many of you looking at this, can say, no, you've got that in the wrong category, and those aren't accurate divisions. But what I thought I would do is go through this stylized matrix, because I think it may help us situate our individual schools within it. And that then gets to the question of what, depending on where your school is, what your particular curriculum ought to be. Now up there, that's actually supposed to be formulators, not formulative. We did this quickly. Formulators and implementers, which again, stylized. Most of our schools teach both the formulation of policy and the implementation of policy. But if you stick with me conceptually, you have formulating and implementing, you have generalists and you have specialists. The standard MPA curriculum is in this upper box. where we are teaching people to formulate public policy. We're teaching them to diagnose policy problems, to analyze large quantities of data, to develop a solution, and then to at least think about the implementation of it, and to include thoughts about implementation as part of the solution. And there we teach analytical skills, quantitative and qualitative, a lot of economics, statistics. We teach, or should teach, according to our discussion, policy process and politics, e.g., how do you act, what is the actual political context in which this solution is going to have to be implemented. Many people add ethics. This is actually a debate at the Woodrow Wilson School whether we should do that, but again, if you're thinking about the elements that go into the formulation of public policy. Something that at least was more new to me, we had a very interesting discussion about the notion of the creation of public value being a core part of this curriculum, that we are thinking about collective action, we are thinking about providing collective goods, we are thinking about the creation of public value, and that courses getting at that ought to be a part of the core. Indeed, it was suggested that that was the core of what we were doing, but then there was debate about that. And finally, communication, written communication, oral communication, the ability to not only devise a policy solution, but to communicate it. And there again, I think that's probably the core of many of our schools. Then move over to the implementers. And here again, many of us are doing a bit of both. Some of us are more on that spectrum, and some of us are closer to the spectrum. But here we had a big discussion about governance and about overcoming the public-private divide. What we talked about this morning, multiple sectors coming together, public, private, nonprofit, to tackle specific problems. And so if you're thinking more on the implementation side or the management side, that question of moving from government to governance is a very big part of what you're probably working with. Performance metrics, and again, this is highly relevant if you're working with the nonprofit sector and the public sector and the private sector. How do you know what's working and what's not? We do a lot of teaching about how you measure the performance of non-governmental organization. That can be econometrics, but it can be broader than just econometrics. Information management, that's the shorthand that shouldn't be that short. What I really meant was managing in the context of massive flows of information. One of our participants pointed out the importance of figuring out how you absorb enormous quantities of data, how you use that in your metrics. Law. Now, this is, again, something newer in thinking about implementing, actually also relevant, of course, to formulating policy solutions. If you're outsourcing government services, and the United States is outsourcing government services massively, as many of you, of course, seen with the Blackwater scandal, if you're outsourcing, you might be outsourcing aid, development policy. I mean, the USAID used to have 7,000 employees. Now it has 3,000, and it outsources all the rest to NGOs. But that's done within the framework of a contract. How do you write that contract? How do you assess performance with that contract? What are the laws governing that contract? So adding law, and how do you teach law? We talk quite a bit about that. And finally, leadership and how we think about leadership, how we teach leadership. Mary Jo Bain, who does teach leadership, said she talks about it both as an activity and a set of skills. Did I get that right? And there are ways to get students to practice leadership and to think about it. So those are sort of some things we do traditionally, some new things in each of those areas. And again, I think if you plot your school, you'll be more on this side or more on that side. Relatedly, this is training generalists. This is training the people who say, they can do any kind of foreign policy or any kind of domestic policy, who connect up lots of different substantive bodies of knowledge. But of course, at the same time, we're operating in a highly specialized world. So we also talk quite a bit about how you deal with specialization. Multiple ways. Concentrations, many of our schools do that. Certificates, growing number of certificates within a general field. That's been a big area for us. PhDs, if you really want someone to be specialized in a particular area of knowledge, we're pioneering joint PhDs with the disciplines or simply public policy PhDs, but you need more than 1 or 2 years. Joint degrees, we talked a great deal about that. I talked about that this morning. Again, if you really need someone to have a body of specialized knowledge, public policy school may not be the place to communicate that, have a joint degree. And finally, and very interestingly in this context, we talked about partnerships and division of labor. So in the GPPN, if you say, look, LSE has got a fabulous program on development in a particular area of the world, and the Columbia has a wonderful program on NGOs, you might think about simply sending your students to the other school for that area of expertise. We can't all do everything. We know that. But these are a bunch of different options, again, more on the formulation of policy side. How do you give people the special expertise to formulate, to diagnose and formulate answers to public policy problems in specific areas? And finally, highly specialized, specialization on the implementing side, on the administration and management side. Well, here, at least in the Wilson School, and I think in many of your schools, we train people or we educate people who go into local government, who go into regional government, state government in the United States, provincial government, national government, and international government. And of course, also we educate people who go into non-governmental organizations. So those 4 categories people talked about. On the sort of edge of new things in this debate, we talked about the traditional distinction of domestic versus international. And at Georgetown, they divide between domestic students and domestically focused students and internationally focused students. That's a traditional division. At the Heritage School, they talk about comparative versus international. There is no more domestic. It's all comparative. If you're studying transportation policy or health policy, or environmental policy, you want to know what other countries are doing. The Wilson School, we're pushing in that direction. I don't think we're there yet. So that it's really a division and specialization versus comparative or international, thinking globally or thinking comparatively. And finally, we had a wonderful conversation from Chinese participants, participants from Dubai, from Qatar, from various European countries, but the critical discussion of what individual countries need and how you think about all of these issues if you are trying to produce people for the Chinese government or an African government or a government in the Middle East. That then led us back to, well, do you produce the kind of government officials that your government wants? Or do you educate people who will be leading figures in public policy debates? So it may be never-ending, but it's circular. But I would like to leave you with the idea that instead of choosing, you think of locating your school somewhere on here and think then about what are the various possibilities, what is best for your own core curriculum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. Any quick burning question? If none, we go to breakout session B, Fujin.
So, thank you. I'm happy to report we had a very lovely session this morning, lasting for about 2 hours altogether. We divided it into 2 sections. The first section was we had a representation more on the faculty side than the student side. And the second session, not by design, but by accident, we had more students than the faculty members. And, we noticed that, in the field of public policy education, United States, North America had, relatively speaking, a long history. And both Asia and Europe, relatively speaking, has a shorter history. But in spite of that fact, now if we just look at the demand side of education, we found that employment happens in 3 sectors: the public sector, the non-public sector, NGOs. And that is a surprising case to me. And now, this is the similarity. but we do not have long time series data to see whether that trend will sustain in the context of Asia or Europe. But in the United States, it seems that the case. And impressionally, from my own experience, in the US, there may be some fluctuations, but we do not have very systematic data to see that. Then in Asia, people talk about, since it's new, we talk about a need to convey to employers the benefits and the value addedness of recruiting public policy graduates. And what is needed, compared probably to the case in the United States, there is a great need for marketing. Schools need to have active career service. That we sort of course, do some projection in the future. And so far, we do not have that sophisticated level of career service. And networking is also very important. And probably because of the short history, we do not have a sophisticated network to support our graduates. The other thing we talked about is to increase the chance for employment. We need to emphasize the importance of rigorous training. This is sort of a vague phrase. Specifically, we talked about interdisciplinary learning. When we compare public policy education with disciplinary knowledge, and our advantage seems to be in the area of interdisciplinary training, since our graduates are supposed to tackle real-world problems, and the real world is composed of knowledge of many disciplines, and our aim is to nurture in our students the sense of interdisciplinary position. So in that area, we may have an advantage. The other thing we talk about is the value-based learning for public service. Emery Slaughter talked about leadership value-based, and vis-a-vis that, the business school. And we also talk about, in terms of employment, we are not just looking at government per se. Since government does not exist in isolation with the other sectors of the society, so the employment should aim at the interface between public sector, the society, the private sector, and the NGO. And our students hopefully will have value addedness in the interface between different sectors of the society. And our skill, hopefully, the skill on the part of the graduates, hopefully, will have a holistic problem-solving skills, and that we probably can sell to the market. And so far, I haven't touched about public policy schools in China, because based on the feedback that I have, it seems to me that the case in China is a special case. And I thought, well, spend some time to talk about the Chinese case and explain why we see some uniqueness in the Chinese case. And before I do that, one other point which is important for me to point out is we also see the distinction between, well, if we look at public policy schools in US, in Europe, in Asia, but China, we see most public policy schools provide two kinds of degrees, professional degrees. One is MPA, you're called Master of Public Affairs or Master of Public Administration. This is primarily for mid-career professionals. And in this category, the employment rate is very high, since students comes with experience, work experience for these degrees. The other part is MPP. And that I'm not sure about the case in the United States, but in Asia, the challenge seems to me for those students. They tend to have sophisticated skills in quantitative analysis, but since they do not have work experience, they came from undergraduate students to do a master's degree. And we are lucky to hear one response representing the public sector. And his response is actually both the private as well as the public sector put a high premium on quantitative skills from graduates of public policy schools. Now I turn to the Chinese case. In China, my observation is the public policy schools in China, as of today, only provide one degree. It's MPA. We do not so far provide MPP. And the students we have are sort of unique in nature. Most of them are already junior government officials. So they come for the courses, and in that sense, their schedule very much shape the schedule of our courses offered to those students. So they do not come to universities during weekdays. They came during weekends. So we have to provide MPA courses primarily during weekends. So as a result of that, the employment rate is 100% almost. So it's executive training in China. I guess now if the three sectors, the public sector, the private sector, the NGO, pretty much represent the employment picture of US, Europe, Asia, but China is not that case. They are primarily government officials in the public sector, in other words. And well, to be more specific, in the case of Peking University, I guess in the case of Tsinghua University, Tsinghua is a graduate school of public policy and management. And Tsinghua does not have a large components in terms of academic training. It's professional training because Tsinghua's program more or less start from scratch. So they are more close to the public policy schools that we see in US, in other parts of Asia, in Europe. Whereas Peking University, I guess this also reflects to a large extent for other schools of public policy in other universities in China. It's really a combination. On this hand, we have departments, professional training, Department of Political Science, a bit of economics, sociology. For that, we continue to offer academic degrees, BA in political science, basically in the case of Peking University, BA in political science, economics, and the public policy, MA in basically three tracks, and a PhD, the same. But on this side, we are similar to what other public policy schools are doing professional training. The employment on this side, while the rates, even for top universities like Beijing, we are under tremendous pressure to hit 100% employment rate. But on this side, the professional training part side, so far it's 100%. And we talked about the shaping process. Is there a chance for us to shape the demand side? I guess in the US case, it's an endogenous process because public policy schools in the US has been there for a long time. So what we see here is a result of an endogenous supply on demand side, and it works out for a long time. For new public policy schools, actually it's a question for us. And as I work as the executive dean of the school, what we did at Peking University, we are looking actually at three layers of the things, the impact we'll have as a strategy, sort of to shape the demand side. Peking University as a whole has a long history, and actually is very influential in producing high officials in China. Actually, the party history has much to do with Peking University, or the other way around. And the history of PRC has much to do with Peking University. So university as a whole. But as a school of government, as a sub-unit of government, what are we trying to do to continue that impact? We look at our students as having three kinds. One is degree students. And we see them as having impact long-term. It will take a long time for them to make a big impact on society. And to shape the demand side, we are also looking at the immediate the level of immediate impact. For that, we also engaged in executive training. We recruit in collaboration with our traditional structure of recruiting officials, the key organization, the party's organization department for recruiting of senior officials, for them to come to Peking University for training for a short period of time, say a month or 2 months, then for them to go back. Because at the bureau level, a bureau level official is like a mayor of a big city in China. So they are already very influential. And in between the two, long-term and immediate-term impact to shape the demand side, we do MPA. And we recruit about 200 MPA students on a yearly basis. And we also have a joint MPA with the National School of Public Administration. The director is sitting there. And that we also did with the collaboration of the party's organization department. So the ranking for our MPA students for that joint degree program is relatively higher than the MPA students we have. And we hope in the years to come, they will also have at least an intermediate impact. When we add all 3 levels of impact together, and we do that, say, for 10 years or 10 years down the road, we have make a difference in terms of the impact on the society. I guess that's all I need to report.
Thank you. I must say that we all envy you when you have 100% employment rate. Any quick questions? Yes, please.
My name is Neo Boon Xiao from the Lee Kuan Yew School. Let me just raise a question that relates to the supply and demand. And again, I'm relatively new to the public policy scheme, having spent most of my life in a business school. But let me ask whether it might be a bit naive for the public policy schools to assume that government will recruit from public policy schools. That is not the world that exists outside. Banks no longer recruit from finance graduates alone. Similarly, companies and even governments today recruit from a whole range of disciplines, schools, for the diversity of the ideas, so that we have the adaptability to cope with problems that we may not be able to define today. And if schools of government assume that government will only recruit from them, I think we are going to be disappointed. If that is the case, then what do we do with our graduates who are not mid-career, who are entry level? If schools of government do not recruit them, or government do not recruit from the public policy schools, and they don't, where do our graduates go to? Or should go to?
Fujian?
Well, my quick response is the program of public policy is a graduate program. Actually, when we look at the educational background of our MPA candidates, they come with a variety of educational background in different training. And for us to add value to their background, and with the context, the general background of China moving from central planning to a market system, and also with China increasingly involved with the world, the rest of the world. Traditionally, when we look at the government, we assume, probably at the time the assumption was right, it's the business of political science, because we are looking at the hierarchy. But since an increasing amount of resources being allocated by the market, so in our courses, we have courses on political science and public policy, and increasingly so, we emphasize economics and public policy. To us, the reality is that each country, it's a combination of different proportions. So in that, we think, well, for our junior officials in the government, already in the government, to come back to learn, we need to sensitize them to the appropriate role of government vis-a-vis the role of the market. And that sort of fits them well against the general background of China's reform from plan to market.
Thank you. I think, Boon Xiong, you've asked a big question that probably we have to take some time to discuss. We probably can't cover it now. But just one technical point. Can I tell someone on the technical side that there's There's some kind of sound behind us, by the way. You can't hear it in the audience, but the members of the panel can hear some kind of sound behind down there. If someone, technician, can go and have a look at that, see where that sound is coming from. Okay, the next, we're now switching to pedagogy. And the breakout session C was on teaching nationally diverse classrooms. Rob Lieberman.
And I want to thank, first my co-facilitator, Professor Scott Fritzen of the Lieberman School. We had an interesting, wide-ranging set of discussions. And what's interesting, one of the interesting things that comes out of it is how much overlap there was between the things that surfaced in our discussions that began from the point of view of pedagogy and the things that we've heard in the previous discussions, especially the questions of curriculum that Henry raised following up on this session. So I want to try my best to boil down what, as I said, a wide-ranging conversations into a couple of separate points. The first has to do with cases. Most of us do a lot of teaching in our curricula based on using cases. A lot of teaching from policy based on cases. And the question about nationally diverse classrooms generated a lot of discussion about cases and a couple of questions. Where do cases come from? What's the right balance between cases that are generated from the country or the region where the school is located and the countries or regions where the students come from? This was a particular question for schools like in the United States, where we tend to reach immediately and naturally to cases from the United States, even in the face of extremely diverse student bodies and student classes, and what's the correct balance between the home country and host country cases. That led to the second set of questions about how cases are deployed. Cases that tend to, in the first instance, focus attention, pedagogical attention on specific places, specific instances of policy problems, often are intended to be deployed, not necessarily as teaching tools to learn about specific things, the specific material of case, but as ways of teaching about more general problems, more general propositions, more general theories or approaches or analytical tools and skills. So the national diversity question leads immediately back to questions about how we manage our curriculum that's supposed to balance the general and the specific in very simple ways that we've already heard. To equip students from a variety of different backgrounds and from a variety of different national contexts to take back with them to their home countries, if that's where they're intending to return, or to their home regions, to take back with them a set of general skills and a generalized approach to public policy problems that will be useful to them when they're meeting the specific problems of their home regions. That was set alongside a whole series of questions about regional specialization of schools. Is it reasonable for schools located in different places, even when they're teaching broadly diverse, nationally diverse student bodies, to say, well, we are a school in the United States, and therefore our curriculum is going to be tilted toward, focused on cases from the United States, approaches that originated in North American social science or North American approaches to public administration, for example, while schools in Europe will take the same approach but substitute Europe for North America. We are a school in Europe, and those of you who have chosen to come to a school in Europe as opposed to a school somewhere else can reasonably expect the balance to shift toward Europe, and schools in Asia, and so on and so forth. Is that a reasonable or sensible way of specializing among schools or dividing labor among schools, even when we're all facing nationally diverse student populations? And finally, there was discussion about the use of cases and a variety of other kinds of exercises, simulations and role-playing exercises, not so much, again, as a way of teaching specifics, teaching about specific places, specific problems, specific substantive areas, but as a way of forcing students to confront things that are different. We talked about exercises in which students are asked to switch roles from their accustomed roles, to think about, in the United States, that would mean asking our students to pretend to be Republicans, to ask students to take the role of, put themselves in the heads of someone from another country, someone from another background, another kind of tradition, and think through a problem in that person's shoes or in that person's mind, as a way of sort of using or exploiting national diversity in the classroom and the tension between the diversity in the classroom and the curriculum to help students make analytical progress. So there's a whole range of questions surfaced around cases and the relationship between the specificity of cases, the diversity of the student body, and the pedagogical goals of our programs. That sat side by side with a whole other set of questions that arose out of a discussion of nationally diverse classrooms about the sort of generality or the universality of the curriculum and of our pedagogical approach. To what extent is what we, and again, this overlaps very neatly and closely with the things that Anne-Marie raised in her discussion of the curriculum, and that is, to what extent are the things that we teach in our different national or regional settings to nationally diverse classrooms? To what extent are the tools and skills that we're teaching in public policy education universal? Ranging from the perspective that knowledge is knowledge and analysis is analysis, and whether it takes place in Asia or in North America or in Europe or elsewhere, and whether it's focused on economics or quantitative techniques or management or politics or whatever, that knowledge is knowledge and can be lifted out of national context, and we need to help our students see the world that way, as against the perspective that says, well, no, there are much more specialized, particularized perspectives that to which we need to introduce our students. So that was a question, or a set of questions that arose out of our discussion of nationally diverse classrooms. A third set of questions that occasioned a fair bit of discussion was the simple, not simple, but a different kind of pedagogical challenges that come out of having very different national traditions and national backgrounds represented in the classroom. And that is simply differences among students that can either get in the way of, make it difficult to learn, or can facilitate learning. Things like differences in English language background or English language skills that can pose barriers for students in learning from each other and learning from instructors and in mastering the very difficult large amounts of material that our curricula tend to throw at them. Differences in levels of academic preparation from students coming from different national backgrounds. Differences in national educational traditions that lead to differences in the kinds of expectations that students approach graduate education with. Students coming from Asia, from North America, from Europe, approach graduate education or tend to approach graduate education in different ways, which leads sometimes to mismatches between faculty expectations and program expectations and student performance and student behavior that we need to that pose challenges. At the same time, several people suggested that there are ways in which we can turn this proposition around and make the cultural and national differences among our students a resource that students can learn from each other. And there was a lot of discussion about ways in which in classrooms we can use differences in national backgrounds and differences in nationality and as ways to facilitate more horizontal learning. Students can learn from each other by taking lessons back and forth between the general and the specific, by applying a lesson that might be learned from a case in one context to another national context, by trying to think through the problem of how can this American case that we've just discussed, how can the lessons from this American case be applied in an Asian context, in a European context, in the context of my home country, or trying to think through the implications of how general analytical lessons and analytical frameworks can be applied in the very specific problems of home countries. So there are ways in which we can turn around the challenges and make them into opportunities. And finally, as I said, this was a very wide-ranging discussion. Several colleagues branched the discussion out from the issues of national diversity among the students to thinking about other kinds of diversity and how they affect the classroom and how they affect our curricula and our teaching and our pedagogy. Some of these have already come up in the last discussion, sort of what you might call sectoral diversity. Diversity among our students in both the backgrounds, the professional backgrounds that they bring to the classroom, and the expectations about their careers. Government, service, NGO, nonprofit world, private sector backgrounds and expectations all intersect and interact in our classrooms. That poses a whole other set of questions about how to approach diversity in the classroom, the diversity of needs and expectations and demands of our students, and how to manage differences in the needs that students heading for these different paths impose on our classroom teaching. And another area of diversity that frankly Scott and I hadn't even really contemplated in setting up the session, but arose in the discussion, was diversity at a level up from the classroom, diversity among the faculty. Diversity among our colleagues within the schools about expectations about what goes into the curriculum, about what kinds of teaching, what kinds of subjects, what kinds of expectations, what kinds of assessment tools we need to use for our students, and how to manage that kind of diversity at the faculty level, not in managing our own individual classrooms, but in constructing a curriculum and constructing a program. So these are just a few of the highlights of the issues that we addressed. I think, like my colleagues who have already spoken, we found that there were more questions than answers, but I think it was a very stimulating set of discussions and an opportunity for us to observe that none of us is alone in facing these challenges, that the challenges are common and mutual. And I think it was a very fruitful discussion for us to sort of compare notes and think through some of these ideas together. So thanks to Scott and thanks to all of my colleagues.
Thank you, Rob. Any quick questions? If not, we go to session D, which is entitled "Bringing the World of Professional Practice into the Classroom" by Bob Klitgaard. Bob.
I'm going to come over here so I can stretch my legs. If any of you want to walk around and stretch your legs, I certainly understand. So the task of our group was to consider the connections between theory and practice. We began with a theorist's point that, in theory and practice are the same thing. So there's no problem. But of course we realize that our profession, our calling in these schools, is to somehow bring the two together. And we decided we would talk about success stories that each of us had experienced in somehow bringing practice into our classrooms. The first question is sort of, why do you want to do this? What's the point of bringing practice and theory together? First, there was the question of bringing practice to the theorists, or to the pre-professional students or undergraduate students who are busy immersing themselves in statistics, economics, analytical methods, political theory, and so forth, and bringing practice to them. What's the point there? Well, one was to help them figure out why they should be learning this at all. Why should they even master this stuff? A lot of them who have professional aspirations don't really understand why they need to understand microeconomics or the chi-square statistic or something like this. And so the variety of tools we use, the case method, some of the internships, some of the practicums, are ways to demonstrate the uses and limitations of the analytical techniques that are at the core of many public policy programs. Common problems emerged here. For example, in the case of internships, there was a really telling critique of internships by one of the clients who hires our students for internships. And she pointed out that oftentimes the expectations of the students were out of proportion with the jobs that they were expected to do, that there was high transactions costs in recruiting and helping the students along. And she suggested that we pay a lot more attention as institutions to how we do the internship program. Karen Hauf of Hertie responded by saying that she has had some good experiences at Hertie with a program they call, I think, the Key Client Program, where they devote a budget and some faculty time to develop relationships with key clients, which result in policy analysis exercises as well as internships, and they spend some time to develop that mechanism carefully. There were a variety of capstone projects discussed. I was interested that there are some versions of that which I hadn't seen before. For example, Caroline Brassard here of LKY has an interesting empirical analysis workshop rather than just a policy analysis workshop where she works with clients. And there were other ones in organizational behavior. Another sense of the motivation, why learn this, was captured by let's see, where is it? What's his name? Nick Binadel. Nick, am I pronouncing your name Binadel? Of the Gordon School. Nick has a very interesting task in a context where, South African context, where race and class differences are the point, to get students from an elite background and a rather homogeneous social status to understand the context, indeed the calling in which they'll be working. Nick invites people, not only practitioners who are the elite policymakers and managers, but taxi drivers, Social Security recipients, students in need, to come into classroom sessions with the students. And we asked him, do you structure those conversations? He said no. But they're wonderfully valuable for his students to remind them why they're doing this at all. What is the clientele they're trying to serve, and what are the needs they're trying to serve? There was also a very interesting story by Alexei Bogaturov, I hope I have your name correctly, Alexei, of the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, who described another kind of setting which is different from theory, and that is the whole notion of business-government relations in Russia, and how there are shadow relationships, and he didn't mean corrupt relationships or necessarily bad deals, but just a whole different reality. And so he invites practitioners to come in and give 2 or 3 classes on those shadow realities, as he called it, so that students can understand where their theory intersects and doesn't intersect with that reality. There was an ardent discussion in one of our sessions about corruption in Asia and how to bring that reality face to face with the rational actor models and bureaucratic politics models so prevalent in classical public policy education. There was a bit of despair in the air about students who go back out to institutions where their theories and case examples don't necessarily apply. But then there were also good stories about situations where people can learn from positive examples of dealing with corrupt situations. And the air of futility which seems to surround this subject, but doesn't seem to surround, for example, tariff policy or public health policy, was, we hoped, slightly dispelled by that discussion. There's another area of theory and practice, the connection, which is how do you bring theory to practitioner students? It was noted, of course, that we have pre-professional students, mid-career students, and executive course students who are quite different along the spectrum of theoretical predisposition and capability and their need for the inoculation of practice. And it was interesting that many of the schools with a heavy diet of mid-career students and executive course students said their problem was how do we get these guys to even think about theory effectively, much less practice. And there were some interesting success stories there, again, with case method and with testimonials by practitioners who would come in and, in effect, say, I used to be an alcoholic, but now I've taken this regime and I'm no longer succumbed to, that kind of testimonial somehow impressed these practitioner students. And then there was a third level of dialogue, not so much on the educational side, how do we get our theoretically minded students to become more aware of practice, either for motivation to learn the material or to change their calling and what they were doing, or how to get our practitioner-oriented students more theoretically minded, but also how to make our research more practically relevant, more theoretically imbued, how to do that. And here the secret, I think, is 3 questions that Peter Drucker taught everyone to ask of what they do. What business are you in? Who is your customer? What does your customer value? We had some very interesting discussions about the failure of public policy schools to do what you said, which is to ask our customers, namely the people who are employing our graduates, what do they need to know to do their jobs effectively? And on the research side, what do you need to know, dear policymaker? How do you like it delivered? What's the timing? What's the format, and what's the point of policy research to you, dear policymakers? How may we involve you in the design of the problems, the doing of the research, the sharing of the results, and indeed the creative process of figuring out what the results mean? This is an open question. I think we have not answered that very well, but I think it's a fascinating one for us to think about later. So let me close on this point. The big question here is, how do we blend theory and practice? The abiding point was made by one of the professors at LKY. Ed, are you here? What's your last name, Ed? No, I need to know. These guys always introduce themselves by their first names here at LKY. It's such a friendly place. Ed made the point that as a young professor, he feels the need to be able to travel around the region so he has some verisimilitude in his teaching about Myanmar or Vietnam or China to his students. He also feels the need to get some substantive depth in particular areas of policy, so he has some credibility on that score as well. But he admitted that his point was not to be the expert propagating the truth to these poor souls in the classroom. The whole idea of being a public policy professor or a professional professor is to become an enabler. Indeed, less a professor than an enabler. And that humility, which he exemplified, I think is a good guide for us about how to blend theory and practice. If we think of ourselves as helping our students through a theoretical framework or a practical example become more creative and more adept, it relieves us of the tension of trying to represent the truth before the ignorant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob, for advertising our humility. I always say when it comes to humility, we are number 1. That's a paradox I've never solved yet. Okay. Okay, I was just trying to wake you guys up, actually. Now we have the last two. May. Okay, the last two. Any burning questions? Sorry, about Bob. None. Okay, we'll go on to the last 2 sessions on the policy school enterprise. Session E is called "The Rise of Academic Diplomacy: Making Exchange Programs and Inter-School Partnerships Work." Sarah?
Thank you, Kishore. I have to say this was an inspired choice of title. I don't know what you think about when you think of academic diplomacy, but we had about 2.5 hours of discussion on making exchange programs and inter-school partnerships work. And for every good idea that was presented as the model of the way to do it, we had another good idea presented that was directly in conflict, presented in an incredibly polite way, you understand, of the opposite way to do it even better. So what I want to do is try and pick out some of the ideas that were presented, and I'll try and do it in a diplomatic way, but they are not necessarily consistent. We did, however, start off with one basic assumed truth, and I think that was that we're enriched by our differences, and that's what makes us try and enter into these partnerships or exchange programs. If you put it slightly more prosaically, travel broadens the mind. And so there was a commitment, even if we couldn't quite explain why there was a commitment, there was a commitment to these sorts of engagements. And perhaps that explains why 5 to 10 years ago people went around collecting MOUs and stuffing them in their bottom drawer. Basically, you had a travel plan that would suit any particular request that came up. By and large, they stayed in the bottom drawer. And I think now we appreciate that we need to be doing something a bit more streamlined, a bit more specific and focused, And we ought to be doing it in a way that addresses student exchange issues, faculty exchange, sharing teaching, trying to produce joint research outputs, trying to have common or joint influences on policymakers, etc., etc. So all of that was an assumed truth. You know, these are good things with capital letters. But because we didn't quite know why they were good things, it meant we didn't quite know how to do these good things. And perhaps for that reason, having, you know, got through all that kind of basic agreed truths, we focused largely on student exchanges. And my private view is that we focused on those because we think they're easier to do. They're not particularly easy to do. We think they're easier to do, but perhaps the truth is we can just see what's being done a bit more easily. And you can point to your boss and say, you know, these are the numbers going through this program. They all go into these particular places for jobs, etc., etc. There's a quantifiable benefit that there isn't really in the other areas that, to my mind, are perhaps more important. But anyway, on the student exchanges, we then got to the diplomatic part of it. You know, it was suggested that there is no one way to do these, and that each particular exchange relationship has to be modified, you know, within the confines of the particular context. And that's no doubt true. And we're all used to doing that sort of thing. So that, you know, if you have an exchange relationship with a university in India, from the LSE's perspective, it's unlikely to work in the same way as an exchange relationship with a university in North America. Nevertheless, even though there was this consensus that we had to take regard to the context, I think we all agreed that some kind of framework was likely to make these exchange relationships work more effectively. And as soon as you start talking about a framework, you start thinking about, well, what sorts of issues are you going to address in a common way? And selection criteria came up as, you know, a number one issue, the quality of the institution. I'm certainly familiar with the idea that, you know, Howard Davies will say to me, we want the LSE to be, you know, the premier social science institution in the world. Sorry, Harvard, but the competition's on. And he doesn't expect me to advance any kind of exchange relationship or partnership relationship that will be in competition with that idea. So in picking the partners that we work with, there is a quality issue that is part of the competition between universities for students, for faculty, and for reputation. So we talked a little bit about how, given that quality constraint, you pick the people that you might engage with. And I think this is certainly the way that we are picking it and picking our partners, and the way that I suppose the other people in the GPPN relationship have picked each other. We're looking for complementarity, not substitutes. We're looking for institutions that can provide something that we can't provide, so that together there's an even better product than either of us could provide individually. So complementarity rather than substitutability. Or if I can pinch someone's idea from this morning, we're looking for a mosaic of excellence rather than a monotony of excellence. And I think that's quite a nice vision of what we're doing. And the reason that we try and engage in those sorts of relationships is because they force faculty members to assess what they're doing. If you're looking for complementary relationships, then you each have to talk in detail about what you think you're excellent at and why you think you're excellent at it. And that does make you be a bit more reflective about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And the outcome, like all challenges to the way you think, is likely to produce something better than if you'd just gone on in your own comfort zone. as I said, we were on teaching relationships, but in the background to having these peer-to-peer, higher quality exchanges for students was the hope, I think, from all of us, that there would be some collaborative research happening in the background, even though we didn't quite know how to encourage it. Now, that kind of peer-to-peer relationship we might describe as a symmetric relationship. Both parties are bringing equal quality goods to the engagement, even if they're different types of goods. That, in some ways, was seen by some people to be a more difficult engagement than asymmetric relationships, where the parties are unequal. And we had quite an interesting and long discussion on asymmetric relationships. How do institutions in the developed world partner with institutions in the developing world so that each gets something of value out of the engagement? And we were provided with a number of models of how to do that were quite interesting. So you might recognize explicitly that you were after different types of outputs and different types of inputs from these relationships. So, for example, an LSE student might have a year in London doing kinds of London city things and that sort of public policy that happens in the UK, and then be exposed to the sorts of situations and public policy initiatives that are happening in the developed world, and we might see that as a terribly valuable experience for the student. But of course, with these asymmetric relationships, there are some fundamental problems that I confess we didn't determine how to solve. So there are, in particular, financial constraints. I mean, that is a number one problem in these asymmetric relationships. There's tuition costs, costs of living differences, human capital costs, time and resources, and I guess as well, the interest in putting long-term commitments by students and by faculty into visiting each other's institutions. Unanswered questions. We had quite a lot of unanswered questions. In fact, we had more of those than questions that we answered. Is there any way, for example, of questioning the underlying assumption that all these engagements happen in English? Is that actually delivering what we want out of these students' exchanges and partnerships? How do we leverage student exchange so that we get better research, more current research, better engagements and interoperability of thinking between governments or NGOs or other consultants and policy implementers? How do we increase the exchange of ideas and knowledge between any of the stakeholders, between students, between faculty, between employers, etc.? In other words, I suppose, how do we conceptualize partnerships in a way that makes them more effective and more sophisticated? And there, I suppose, we're round in a big circle again. But the idea I came out with is that what we're after is this mosaic of excellence. I thought that was a pretty neat way of thinking about our hopes and aspirations in this area. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. At one point when you were speaking, I thought the room became very quiet. I wasn't sure whether you were falling asleep or I thought your point about the fact that in some ways we are partners, in other ways we are competitors, I think raised an eyebrow too, and I think that's a critical point that actually we haven't touched upon. How much do we share to help each other? How much do we keep to ourselves to make sure that we do well and be number one? Okay, now we come to the last one. Sorry, any questions for Sarah? None? Okay. Panel F, Balancing Research, Teaching and Outreach, Michael Storper.
Thank you, Kishore. We were given the task of reflecting about the possibility of balancing research, teaching, and outreach. And I should say the danger of coming last, of course, is that most of the good points have already been made. So I've been trying to think while the other speakers have been saying all these interesting things about what twist I could put on our discussion that would give some added value. And so what I'm about to say is going to take some liberties with what the participants in the session said and try to synthesize in some way. I should say that I initially worked with Wing Tat on the questions that we framed for our participants, but he's not responsible for what I'm about to say here. And it's interesting because in trying to think about the discussions we had about teaching, research, and outreach, I think we came up with the notion that there isn't going to be any balance among these things, and that the notion of balance is probably an illusion. And my personal opinion is that it should be, and that it should be this way. That, and why do I say this? Our discussion was very interesting. In order to think about balance between research, teaching, and outreach, we immediately began to think about the challenges that programs in public affairs have in each of these areas. And those are the things that the previous speakers have already noted. So in research, there's the double challenge of being, let's say, faithful to the rigor of social science, but somehow deeply involved with the world. With teaching, there's the problem, the same problem of giving our students rigor and depth, while at the same time somehow pulling them into the world of action, reality, sensitivity to context, and so on. With outreach, the same thing, bridging between the communities and the many communities of academia and the many communities of action, and trying to connect them with one another. So that immediately explodes the notion of balance, because we, the people who are trying to do all this stuff, have to do all of these different things. How are we ever going to find a balance? And some of our comments made reference to the models that come from the more traditional academic disciplines. So, you know, the model of economics, where there are 3 or 4 flagship journals in which, if you are an academic that is going to make it in the world, first of all, of course, you learn the core keys of the core skills of the discipline. Then you have a research program, you publish in these journals, and you've made it. You have a roadmap. But we don't have the equivalent of that in the field of public affairs. There are some journals that are emerging. There are some notions of key skills that you should have, but we're nothing like what you would call a consolidated, institutionalized field of either academic or professional practice. Now, I think some people in our groups might think that should be our project, that we're simply young and we haven't matured yet, and that someday we'll have the 3 or 4 journals of reference, we'll have the core skills that we learn through our training programs. We'll be able to crank out PhD students that have the same sort of consolidated rigor that, say, we do in political science or economics or sociology and so on. I think that was one point of view that underlay our discussions in the room. I happen to take away a different conclusion from the debates that we had, which is that we may want to do some of those things, but that we'll probably never get there, because the essence of our field actually is to live these contradictions, or to live this diversity of skills and practices that is, for me, the core of this field. And so I think of some of the things that we said about research, for example. One excellent comment was, of course, that a social scientist working in the confines of normal social science doesn't really have to explicitly worry about normative questions. But someone doing research applied to public affairs does. That doesn't, of course, mean that that person is going to make up their idea. I want a better world, and I did some research for how to make a better world. But, of course, what they need to do is draw on the tools of social science that have things to say about what is just, what is possible, what is efficient. Right? That's a bigger task than it is assigned a lot of, we might say, traditional social science. Though there are many social scientists in economics, sociology, political science departments, history departments, who are, of course, giving us lots of lessons about how to do that well. The same thing goes for how we establish the priorities for our research programs. Where should they come from? Well, I think one excellent comment made in our sessions was they should come from problems that exist in the world that we think maybe we can help in solving. So both teaching and practice should push the priorities for research, right? But that means, of course, that our research programs are in a constant state of instability because the world is in a state of dynamism and instability. We can't start from the internal coherence of a research program the way that traditional social science might do. We have to be constantly open to the challenges and contradictions of this rough and ready world and then feed them back into the research programs that we're undertaking. That leads to another central issue that was raised in our discussions, which is how then do we get researchers to take the risks to take on those kinds of questions, given that they may not be emanating from stable, well-defined research programs. And there I think that there was some agreement that we need institutional incentives and resources to help us do that. That means both, of course, the usual thing, money, 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 but it means more than that. It means incentives and environments in which researchers can feel comfortable and ready to, intellectually ready to go into those gray zones or even into those completely obscured zones of inquiry. And so we need to think at the level of our institutions of how we encourage people to do that. That, of course, intersects with another major question, which is the careers of researchers. How do we get people to do that? Already, from the very beginning, going into the public affairs field is risky for a young researcher because there are not the stable points of reference that come from disciplines of that exactly what is the reward structure and what is the trajectory I'm going to lead that's going to lead me to have a job and all the nice things that come from a successful career. Even more so is this the case when we're talking about cutting-edge research, cutting-edge thought, and even more, research that is about cutting-edge practices, which don't have stable reward systems in academia. So we raised all of those things, and I think we, in my view, once we come to the overall conclusion that it's not going to be balanced, it's going to be riding the wave, and we need to figure out ways to ride the wave. Same thing comes from teaching. There were some very interesting comments about the problem not only of theory and practice, but sort of as a double to that of the breadth and depth issue. One person commented and said, I have this feeling that I'm in a kind of a postmodernist situation where I'm dipping into all these subjects, but lightly, and I come out and I think, what do I really know? What am I deep and good about? And then another comment was made that, yes, but if you can't, if you're going to be a real leader, if you're going to rise to the top, you need vision, and being visionary means knowing about a lot of things. And if you know about a lot of things, you're never going to know about each one of them as well as all the experts in the field. So as a leader, ultimately, what you're going to have to do is know how to surround yourself with good experts, and of course to know whether those experts are telling you intelligent things or stupid things. So we went around on the breadth and depth issue, and I think what I come away with as a conclusion is that, unfortunately, we need both breadth and depth, and we're going to have to live this contradiction, right? And it's not going to be easy. And another comment on the teaching was about not just trying to teach models and theories that work, but also making sure that we remember about failures, teaching a lot about failure, and also something that we've had a discussion about at Sciences Po, haven't yet implemented, but which I'm fascinated by, is a suggestion of one of our staff that we teach the history of dissident ideas in public affairs and what they became, where they went, which ones were implemented, which ones weren't, and what was their history. So that was some things about the non-balance that we're probably going to have to live in the teaching area. Same thing, I think, goes to the issue of faculty rewards and the institutional field of that. There's probably not going to be one single model of the member of a School of Public Affairs. Rather, all of these different things are, once again, about diversity. We're going to have some faculty who are more traditionally academic. We're going to have others who are more practice-oriented. We're going to have some who are more interdisciplinary, some who are more single-disciplinary. And the way that we are going to maintain this diversity is through probably the mosaic of individuals and their practices. And we're also going to have to be ready for, of course, people to evolve across the time of their careers, that they may be in more disciplinary and more academic at one moment, more practice-oriented at another, and our systems of evaluation and reward are going to have to accommodate ourselves to this time dimension of their careers. So diversity of people and diversity of what they do over time. Resources, somewhere at the institutional level, this is, of course, an easy one to say, we're going to probably have to have something like a superposition of standard disciplinary and departmental structures with cross-cutting resources, variable geometry of groupings of people doing different kinds of research and teaching activities. And there's probably not one single stable institutional format, and probably multiple belongings for individuals in which they can do all the different things they need to do within the institutions. And then on the outreach, I think we came to the notion that this is the old problem of how do you bridge between the excellent practitioners and the excellent academics. One thing the academics could do, it's an old dream, I know some people think it's naive, would be to try and get the best academics to be involved in improving public literacy about the things that academics know best, and of course, having the academics listen to the excellent practitioners a little bit more. We've been working on some of that in some of our contacts at Sciences Po, and I'm actually less pessimistic than I used to be about this, because you find actually, and I think this is one of the things that I would say is, oftentimes when you find the best academics, they're not the ones that use the most gobbledygook in their talk. They're actually the ones that are able to clearly and synthetically explain what is at the core of even some of the deepest theoretical and cutting-edge areas of their disciplines. That's also true, I think, of some of the most effective leaders in public affairs. They're able to cut through it and say, I know what the challenges are. I can explain what they are to you. So I think actually that we need to break down these sort of images that we might have of each other, which are actually, in many ways, they're incorrect caricatures. So here it is. I think it's art rather than science. We're going to have to live a world of imbalance. It probably means that lots of people will be overworking, but I actually think that that's why most people go into, at least why most people go into academia, is they know they're going to overwork and they find it to be fun. So let's go there.
Thank you. Michael, thank you for confirming that academics like to overwork. And they will find it fun because we're going to overwork them this afternoon. Okay, we have about 5 or 10 minutes time for discussion. Does anyone have any questions? Or do any of the facilitators have any comments on each other or challenges? Or interesting. This crowd doesn't like to be overworked, you know. Well, if that's the case, I hope you'll join me in thanking the facilitators. But don't disappear because, this is a logical point in time to have a coffee break. But we worked out that if you give you a coffee break now, you will not come back for our final remarks. So we're going to do our final remarks now very quickly. And I'll invite, first of all, first thank the facilitators very much, please. And now I'm going to invite my three GPPN partners to come on stage together with Anne-Marie Slaughter and Bob Klitgaard, and then we will do just a very quick round of final observations, and then you'll go for the last coffee break. Please come up. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. Is Howard going to be here? Are you going to be here? Huh? Okay. So you want to take his place in the meantime? Yeah. 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 Why don't you stand in then? If he's, I don't see him. Come. Oh, just some. Okay, I think to be kind to all of us, we will try and do this very quickly. We'll start with Anne-Marie Slaughter and Bob Klitgaard, who will hopefully give us their observations of today's discussions. And then I'll invite my three GPPN partners, depending on their state of readiness. You volunteer to be number 1, number 2, number 3, or number 4. So Anne-Marie and Bob, please. Yeah.
I'd said to Bob that I was going to summarize the day in 3 sentences, and he said, I dare you. I may not do 3, but maybe 5. What I take away from the day's discussions is we are in an age of tremendous specialization, still primarily on the public policy side, training generalists. And I think we should think about those people in 3 different ways. If many of you have read The Tipping Point, you'll be aware of this. As connectors, as cross-fertilizers, and as creative thinkers. We've traditionally always thought of them as connectors and cross-fertilizers and creative thinkers across disciplines and across theory and practice. That much, I think, is quite traditional. I come away from the last 2 days thinking that we are also now thinking of them as connectors and cross-fertilizers and creative thinkers across sectors. Again, public, private, and nonprofit, and across countries. Thank you. Wow.
Thank you. Bob was counting your number of sentences. Okay, Bob.
That's setting a very low bar. Yesterday we learned about a changing world around us of institutions and policies, and about varying settings in which our analysis take place, namely Asia as being different from other parts of the world, indeed Asia having a lot of within Asia variants as well. And this poses questions, so are we doing the right things? Are we studying the right things, doing the right kinds of research? What next for us given the changing world and the fact that regions vary so markedly? I would summarize my own reaction by saying more like us. More like us. We should be more like us, not different. Our core ideas are that we try to extend the reach of reason into politically sensitive domains. That's one of our core values. Another one is that we are trying to make a difference on important issues facing our region and our world. And a third core that we have is we're trying to help with management and leadership in a time, as I said before, that those are under stress within our countries and across the world. So being more like us means that we have to do more hard thinking and applications, that we have to be even more open to practice and to varieties of problems that we didn't know before, and even more open to collaboration. And I'm excited to have met so many interesting people here, to have heard your great ideas. And I would urge us all to try to find some low-hanging fruit, to wit. Let's see if we can find one course that we could co-teach, and one research project that we could try to work on together, one example of each, and see if we can move forward. So the next time we meet, we can say, that was a great class you taught in our course. And that was a terrific idea that your research assistant had for our project. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those were excellent comments. Rob, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Well, it's hard to improve on Bob and Anne-Marie's summary of the last 2 days, but I want to end our sessions with a couple of observations that I've taken away from the last couple of days. One is that what we do in our schools is hard. Teaching public policy is hard. Teaching public policy in a global context, in a cross-national context, and a cross-regional context is hard. There are challenges that it poses for students, for faculty, for curricula, for all of the elements of our schools. And it's difficult. And I think the last discussion especially has surfaced some of those challenges. But at the same time, it's essential that we do what we do and that we think hard about how to do it better, and that we do it together, and that we do it globally. And I think the GPPN is an essential part of us, and it's certainly for us at SEPA and at Columbia, our participation in the GPPN is a solace when we think about how hard it is to do what we do, but it also highlights the fact that what we all do collectively is essential, and I think it's important that we keep doing it. So again, I wanted to thank Kishore and the Lee Kuan Yew School for being just tremendous hosts for the last couple of days. We were delighted to be a part of it, and we look forward to many, many more such collaborations. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rob. Are you ready, Sarah?
Yes, I'm ready. I think the longer you wait, the less there is left to say. So I'm going to get in. I kind of wish I'd been sitting right at the other end. It's true that it's hard. It's certainly true that it's important to do the things that the Global Public Policy Network is about, and all the schools who are teaching public policy are engaged in. Don't you think it's surprising that the sorts of issues that we're dealing with, and that we hope to send our students out to deal with it still better, are so basic? On the kind of Maslow's hierarchy of human need, you look at, I don't know what order he put them in, but you start off with basic things like water, food, health, housing, education. And for so long we've treated them as domestic public policy problems, and we look at the developed world and they're not solved. And you look at the developing world and they're not solved. But, you know, what can we say about that if we haven't managed ourselves? So I think part of the ambition of getting group of people together like this and forming the Global Public Policy Network is that the global bit, the geographical bit, will bring together a much broader range of solutions that we can debate. And the public policy bit, it's true, is theory and practice. So we want, in the theory side, different disciplines engaged in a very sophisticated way. We do need people who have depth in their own discipline and the intelligence to be able to communicate across disciplines. We can't all be experts in everything. But that's the theory bit. And then the practice bit is getting people from different sectors to work together. I mean, say you take a housing problem or a health problem. It's not solved by just getting the experts from that sector with the discipline experts from that sector to think about it in a national way. It's solved by getting more people from different sectors, different disciplines, and different geographies together. And that's the ambition of the Global Public Policy Network.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Richard, just one request. Don't say everything else that needs to be said. Just keep 1 or 2 points for me.
Okay, Kishore. Well, I've been learning a lot over these 2 days. First thing, I learned that coping with public policies means to face emerging complex questions with unstable, ill-defined challenges at stake, a clear sense of emergency, and a tremendous feeling of solitude within this world of so much specialized scientists and practitioners. And why did we decide to create this network? It's to merge our solitudes and to transform it in a capacity, in the power to suggest, not only to suggest new solutions, but new ways of questioning the issues and to compare the very different ways of questioning the issues. In France, we are still perhaps behind. Some say they are for the globalization, and some others say we are against what they call mondialization or globalization. What is at stake is that there are many, many globalizations on work at the same moment. And this is the very title. It's Globalization Asia or Asian globalization. There is an American globalization. Mario Monti pretends that there is a European vision of globalization, and I do support him. The Brits thinks globalization is theirs. And so we have to work together to understand first the differences we can share. And I don't think that we wish to be clones. We have differences, and we have to assume these differences, but not to the extent to get conflict. And I hope that the network will be developing of universities or schools, but also will develop the issues on which we are able to say something very interesting for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I realize that only I stand between you and the coffee break. You know, when the conference began yesterday, I wasn't sure how I would feel at the end of the conference, you know. Would I feel more pessimistic? Would I feel more optimistic? Or would it be the same? I'm pleased to report, actually, I feel more optimistic after 2 days of discussion. So let me explain why. First, as you know, the theme we chose was about globalization. And as you know, I mentioned that I predict the Asianization of globalization. I mean, I was pleased to note that there's an acceptance around the world that yes, we have to do something about the rise of Asia. But more importantly, when I heard Mario Monti speak yesterday about the Europeanization of globalization, as I thought about it, I realized that actually we are on the same track. Because there is no fundamental contradiction between the Asianization of globalization and the Europeanization of globalization, because we all want to move on a rules-based track. We want a more peaceful, orderly, stable world. And if European rules deliver that to us, the Asians will embrace it wholeheartedly. But of course, as we know, the big elephant in the room is the Americanization of globalization, which is a reality that we've had to deal with. But I think we are actually, in that sense, moving into a more interesting world where we can now talk about the Americanization of globalization, the Europeanization of globalization, the Asianization of globalization, And in the course of it, I hope we will heed what Bob Klitgaard said, that our role in some ways, the most important role we have is to advance the forces of reason. And if we in public policy education advance the forces of reason, then we are making the world a better place. And that's why I'm optimistic. And this is why also I believe that a discussion like we are having now, and as I explained, when we have the globalization of the public policy enterprise, I can confidently predict that if we had the same conference 3 years from now, there will be many more public policy schools. I already know of several that are being planned to be set up. I know that there will be a whole new number of Asian schools of public policy coming up. So this is clearly a sunrise enterprise. And clearly we do need to have meetings and gatherings like this to discuss the issues of public policy education. So this brings me to the last and final point, which is, of course, the big question in everybody's mind is, so what happens? Are we going to have a third GPPN conference? And the answer is, I don't know. The reason I don't know is that the 4 partners, CIPA of Columbia University, London School of Economics, Spo, and us, we actually, after you all leave, we're going to meet again tomorrow morning, 4 of us. And I think we will reflect a great deal on what has happened yesterday and today, and think about what we can do as a network, to advance the issue. So after we've had our discussion, we will send the report to all of you. And I can also pleased to inform you that we will be coming out. You must have noticed in your bag, we had reports on the Raffles Forum. We had reports on our Brookings Forum. We'll have a similar report sent to you also on the 2-day exchanges. So you will not, all the wisdom that you left with us will not be wasted. We will send it back to all of you. So with that, I hope now you allow me, first of all, to thank the organizers. I can tell you that an incredible amount of work goes behind the scenes. All the ladies and gentlemen you saw guiding you, meeting you, assisting you, feeding you, sometimes forgetting to give you coffee at lunch, but we're not perfect. But it was a lot of work went in. I hope you'll allow me to invite you to join me in thanking them and the facilitators and all the other contributors. Thank you.